In 2018, a father and son drove into the Great Smoky Mountains for a weekend camping trip. They never came home. For 5 years, no one could say what happened. Not the police, not the search teams, not even the people who loved them most. But when a drone camera drifted over a stretch of forest, no map bothered to name, it captured something man-made, something hidden. And what they found would tear a family in half. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Sarah Whitaker. I was 42 when it happened. I worked nights at the trauma ward in Knoxville, Tennessee, and co-parented my teenage son Josh with my ex-husband Daniel. Now Daniel and I weren't close anymore, not since the divorce, but we kept things civil. Birthday dinners, school pickups, shared Christmas mornings. He loved that boy with everything he had. That much was never in question. Daniel had been hiking those mountains since he was a teenager. The Smokies were his second home. He led scouts, taught wilderness survival. He could name every ridgeline by memory. And when he asked to take Josh camping that October, I didn't hesitate. 3 days. That was the plan. He'd pick Josh up Friday after school, drive out to Cataract Falls, and they'd be home Sunday evening. I remember standing in the doorway as they loaded the gear into his old Ford pickup, Josh practically bouncing with excitement, and Daniel giving me that quiet smile he always used when things felt steady. Back by 6, he said, "Promise." That was October 12th. The weather turned colder than expected that weekend. I remember because I was working a double shift and the ER filled up with folks slipping on icy porches. Still, I figured the guys were bundled up and fine. Daniel had taken Josh out in worse. But by Sunday evening, 6 p.m., then 7, nothing. No text, no call. At 8:47, I checked my phone for what felt like the 100th time. Nothing but silence. I called Daniel, straight to voicemail. I called again, and again. Then I stared at the screen, heart racing, fingers numb. I didn't want to panic. I really didn't. But something in my gut was twisting hard. I scrolled through my contacts, stopped at a name I'd never hoped to need, and hit call. Great Smoky Mountains Emergency Services. The voice answered. "This is Ranger Thompson. My ex-husband and my son," I said. "They were supposed to be back by now, from a camping trip. I can't reach either of them." I remember how still the house was, how the quiet suddenly felt wrong. Josh should have been home by now, and I should have been yelling at him to put his dirty laundry in the basket, not trying to describe him over the phone to a park ranger. And that was the moment it all began, when a weekend in the woods started unraveling into something no one was prepared to face. They sent the first team out just after sunrise. I was still in my scrubs, sitting at the kitchen table staring at my phone like it might blink to life if I waited long enough. Ranger Thompson had told me to stay home, that they'd contact me the moment they found anything. But waiting like that, every minute felt like a punishment. By 7 a.m., they'd reached the trailhead at Cataract Falls. Daniel's truck was still there, right where he'd said he'd park it. Blue Ford passenger door locked driver's side open. The keys were in the ignition. Nothing inside the cab looked disturbed. No signs of a struggle. No blood. Just silence. Detective Maria Santos was assigned to the case that morning. She called me from the trailhead, calm voice, steady tone. She told me she'd worked missing persons cases in the Smokies before. Said most of them ended the way you hope they won't. She walked me through everything like she was narrating a routine. She mentioned the trail log book Daniel had signed in at 2:30 p.m. on Friday, October 12th. D. Whitaker plus son. 3-day backcountry. Cataract Falls. His handwriting was neat, steady, like he hadn't been in any kind of panic when they went in. The dogs caught their scent quickly. The first 1.5 miles was easy to follow, just like the maps said. But right near a narrow ridge where the trail splits west, they lost it. The dogs stopped, turned in tight circles. One of the handlers said they looked confused, like the scent just lifted, he told Santos. She mentioned the weather, how a freak storm blew through the mountains that weekend, Saturday night into Sunday morning. Heavy rain, then an early cold front, snow even, in October. She said it was likely that washed away tracks or maybe even disoriented them. It wasn't uncommon, but something about her voice made me think she didn't fully believe that either. Over the next 2 days, they covered everything from Cataract Falls to the surrounding ridgelines. Ground teams hiked double shifts. Helicopters scanned from above, but the tree canopy was thick and stubborn. From the air, it was just endless green, no breaks, no flashes of gear, no movement. They checked the shelters, the caves, every known crossing point. Nothing. By the 18th, the search expanded past 50 square miles. Volunteers started showing up: hikers, park regulars, people who knew Daniel from his scout leader days. I saw the news crews on local channels that night. Watching the footage, I remember thinking how small the rescue workers looked compared to those trees, like they were searching the edge of the world. That evening, Detective Santos asked if she could come by. She didn't want to talk over the phone. When she arrived, she had this calm heaviness to her. She laid out a folder on my kitchen table and flipped it open. Bank statements, credit cards, loan documents. I recognized some of them from our time together. Others were completely new. "You didn't know about the second mortgage?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. We'd split everything clean when we divorced." I assumed he was managing things. "He was nearly $80,000 in debt," she said. "Credit cards, personal loans. And child support enforcement was taking action." There was a hearing scheduled for October 20th. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the paper. The hearing was 5 days after they left. He also missed work on the 10th and 11th. Called in sick, asked about cashing out his pension. My heart sank. That wasn't like Daniel. He prided himself on being reliable, stable. Later that night, I called Miguel, Daniel's younger brother. They'd been closer than most siblings. Miguel had helped build the deck on our old house, babysat Josh more times than I could count. He wasn't running, Miguel said flatly. He lived for that kid. You should have seen them out there. Daniel knew every inch of those woods. But then he paused. There was something he said a few weeks back. I didn't think much of it then. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I should make sure Josh knew how much he was loved. I thought he was being dramatic. You know how he could get when he felt cornered. I hung up, feeling worse than before. The next day, Josh's girlfriend Emma came by. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her mom waited out front in the car. "Josh told me something weird," she said, right before the trip. He said his dad had been talking about starting over, like moving away, going somewhere new. He seemed excited, but a little confused too. I asked if she thought Josh knew anything was wrong. She hesitated, then nodded. He said Daniel was acting strange, packing extra gear, not his usual laid-back self. It didn't make sense. Or maybe it did, and I just didn't want it to. 3 weeks into the search, temperatures in the mountains dropped below freezing at night. Survival experts on the news said the odds weren't good. No fire, no shelter. Most people wouldn't last more than 2 or 3 days. On November 15th, exactly 1 month since they'd left, the active search was suspended. I didn't sleep that night, just kept picturing them huddled somewhere cold, hungry, waiting for someone to find them. I hired a private investigator. He found nothing new. We organized monthly search parties. I built maps, cross-referenced GPS data with ranger reports. Sometimes we'd hear about someone spotting a man and teenage boy upstate or out west. We'd chase every lead. Gas station cameras, old motel logs, blurry security footage. Nothing ever stuck. Over time, people moved on. Kind words, warm condolences. But the search groups got smaller. The calls came less often. Still, Still, every fall, folks from the hiking community would show up at Cataract Falls with backpacks and candles. They started calling it the Whitaker Hike. A scholarship fund was created in Josh's name for kids wanting to study conservation or forestry. It meant a lot, but none of it filled the hole. By the second year, Miguel said what we were both thinking. If Daniel was out there, he would have called by now. In the third year, the insurance company started pressuring me. Technically, you had to wait 7 years to declare someone dead. But in cases like ours, extreme weather, no sign of life, presumed exposure exceptions could be made. I resisted. As long as I didn't sign, part of me could still believe they were alive. But by year 4, I was drained. Emotionally, legally, financially. The papers were processed in March of 2022. Josh was declared legally deceased. As his guardian, I received the life insurance payout, the one Daniel had set up years ago, $200,000. I used it to pay off the house. The rest just sat there, untouched. It didn't feel like money. It felt like loss. I thought that was the end of it, that I'd done everything I could. But a year later, just across the state line, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Chen launched a research drone over a stretch of wilderness no one had ever searched, 8 miles northeast of Cataract Falls. No trails, no foot access, too remote and too dangerous for ground teams. What her drone picked up on that monitor would change everything. It wasn't bodies. It was something man-made, hidden, and it didn't belong in the forest. Ranger Thompson called me 2 days after the drone footage came in. His voice was even measured the way I remembered it being that first night. He asked if I could come down to the ranger station, not urgently, not in a rush, just that there was something he thought I should see in person. When I got there, he wasn't alone. Detective Santos was waiting too, already flipping through paperwork. A map was spread across the table, layered with fresh coordinates, topographic lines, aerial stills from the drone's camera. None of it meant much to me until she pointed to a narrow valley tucked between 2 steep ridges. That spot, she said quietly. It was never searched. Too remote. No access trail, unstable ground, and we didn't have drone coverage in 2018. I remember just staring at the monitor, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. A cluster of rectangular shapes half covered by moss and undergrowth, barely distinguishable from the terrain around them, but unmistakably unnatural. 2 days later, a recovery team was flown in and lowered down by cable. The valley had no natural entry, just dense brush and sheer drop-offs. The first team member radioed back just before 9 a.m. They'd found a structure, not a cabin exactly, but a makeshift lean-to reinforced with stone and pine logs. Nearby, a fire pit ringed with smooth river rocks, hanging food containers, a tarp rigged between 2 trees, its fabric nearly shredded by weather and time. And then came the voice over the radio. "It's them." Detective Santos met me in person that evening. She didn't come with promises or speculation. She just handed me a sealed evidence bag and asked me to sit down. Inside was a leather-bound journal, weather-worn but intact. We confirmed the handwriting, she said. "It's Daniel's. I didn't want to open it, not at first. It felt like trespassing into something private, something not meant to be shared." But she gently turned to the first page and slid it toward me. The date at the top, October 13th, 2018, the same day they signed the trail register. His handwriting was careful, deliberate. "Josh doesn't know yet, but we're not going home. At least not the way we planned. I've been lying to everyone, including myself. The debt is worse than I told Sarah. Child support enforcement is threatening jail time. I can't go to prison. I can't leave Josh alone. This is the only way." My hands were trembling. For a while, no one spoke. Detective Santos let the silence settle. Then she carefully turned the page. October 14th. Told Josh about the detour today. He thinks we're just extending our camping trip. I've been stashing supplies here for weeks, water, food, winter gear. He doesn't suspect anything, he's just excited to keep camping. Entry after entry, the pieces began to form. Daniel had planned this, every bit of it. The supplies, the location, the cover story. He hadn't just vanished, he'd disappeared on purpose, and he'd brought our son with him. October 20th. Josh is asking when we're going home. I told him about the legal stuff. He's furious, said I was selfish. I think he's right. But what was I supposed to do if I go to jail? He's alone. If we stay hidden, I can keep him safe. Those early weeks were filled with details, survival tasks, makeshift repairs, descriptions of the cold setting in. Josh didn't run away. He didn't choose this. But eventually, the tone changed. November 2nd. Josh built a better rain catch than mine. He's adapting. Still asks about his mom. I tell him we'll reach out when it's safe. He's not ready to forgive me, but we're talking again. I didn't cry when I read that. Not right away. I think part of me was still trying to figure out if any of it was real. If the boy Daniel described was really my son, or just a version he wanted to believe in. But then I read the Christmas entry. December 25th, Josh made me a gift pine needles tied in bark. Said it was for Mom. We're both thinner. But we're strong. He's becoming a man out here. I don't remember when I started crying. Just that by the time Santos turned the page, the tears wouldn't stop. The entries continued through January and February, each one more fragile. Food was harder to find. The cold was worse than expected. Josh was growing restless. February 10th. Saw helicopters again. Josh wanted to signal them. I told him no, not yet. Not until we know what comes next. He's starting to question whether I know what I'm doing. I don't blame him. Then came the March entries, and everything shifted. March 15th. Everything is ruined. Josh fell while collecting firewood along the ridge. The rope gave out. It was a 30-foot drop. I got to him fast, but the injuries. There's no way to get help. No way to move him. My son is dying, and it's my fault. I could barely read the next one. March 16th. Josh died at sunrise. I held him all night. His last words were, "Tell Mom I love her." I buried him where he could see the mountains. And the last entry, March 20th. This is my final entry. Sarah, if you ever read this, please know I loved him more than my own life. I thought I was protecting him. I was wrong. I'm going to join him now. I'm sorry. When I finished reading, the room felt so still I could hear the soft ticking of the wall clock behind me. Santos didn't try to say anything. She just waited, hands folded in front of her. A recovery team went back to the site the next day. Just like Daniel described, they found a burial mound marked with carefully stacked stones. Josh was buried facing the eastern ridge, wrapped in what used to be a sleeping bag. Daniel's body was found 2 miles away at the bottom of a steep cliff. The report confirmed it wasn't an accident. He survived 4 days after Josh's death before climbing to the edge and letting go. The official conclusion was clear. Josh died from injuries sustained in a fall. Daniel's death was ruled a suicide. But the explanations didn't do much to settle anything. Miguel came over that week. He sat on the back steps with me, a thermos between us, neither of us saying much for a long time. Then he just said, he made a terrible decision. But he didn't stop loving that boy. Not for a second. Emma reached out too. She was in college by then. She said she remembered how nervous Josh had been that week before they left. He told me Daniel was acting weird. Like he wasn't sure what he was about to do, but he thought it was the right thing. I wish he'd said more. I didn't know what to make of any of it. There were no neat answers, just fragments. The insurance company reviewed the journal and the evidence. Since Daniel had technically faked his death, there was some talk of fraud, but in the end they dropped the matter. They saw I hadn't known. I'd done everything by the book. Still, people in town started talking. Some called Daniel a coward. Others called him a victim. A few said he did the best he could with the hand he was dealt. I didn't argue with any of them. The truth was, I still couldn't tell where love ended and fear began. And, as I'd soon learn, the journal didn't answer everything, not even close. After the burial and the journal and all the official reports, you'd think things would settle, that the story would be over. But it wasn't. Not for me. Not really for anyone who'd been close to it. The answers we got were only surface deep. The kind people think they want timeline, cause, motive, but none of it stopped the questions that kept circling in my head. What I kept coming back to was how long Daniel had survived out there. 5 months. That wasn't some desperate scramble. That was preparation, intention. Every detail in that journal pointed to someone who planned this for weeks, maybe longer. And yet there was no sign, not one in the weeks leading up to the trip, that told me he was ready to do something like that. I turned that thought over more times than I could count. I'd find myself sitting at the kitchen table late at night, journal in front of me, flipping through those pages again, even when I already knew what they said. I memorized the entries like scripture, but it wasn't the words that got me, it was what wasn't there. There were entire stretches of time Daniel left blank. Gaps of 3, sometimes 5 days. And even though he wrote about the routines hunting weather arguments with Josh, there were parts of their survival that felt too clean, too careful, like someone trying to steer the story a certain way. I didn't tell anyone about those feelings for a while. Not Miguel, not Emma, not even Santos. Everyone had grieved in their own way, and I think they all needed the version of events that made sense. The father who cracked under pressure, the son who forgave him even just a little, the wilderness that became too much. But something kept tugging at me. Daniel knew those mountains better than anyone, and if he wanted to vanish, he could have done it alone. He didn't have to bring Josh. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the burial, I drove up to the ranger station again. Thompson was out, but I sat with a junior officer who had helped catalog the recovered campsite. He pulled up photos on his desktop, walked me through the layout, the shelter, the gear, the tools. Then he paused at one image, an overhead shot from the drone. He said, "This isn't in the report, but when we overlaid our maps from 2018 with the drone footage from last month, we noticed something strange." He zoomed in and pointed to a shadow just beyond the shelter tucked in a thicket near the edge of the tree line. We thought it was a rock formation at first, but the drone passed back over this same area 5 days later and the shape was gone. I asked if they checked it out. He said by the time recovery teams got in, there was nothing left to inspect. And given how unstable the terrain was, they weren't going to risk sending anyone down to chase a shadow. But something about his voice, too steady, too rehearsed, told me they had their own questions. I thanked him, took down the coordinates, and left. I didn't know what I was planning to do with them, just that I needed to keep looking. That night I called Miguel. I told him about the shadow, about the gaps in the journal, about the feeling that something was still off. I expected him to tell me I was spiraling, that it was time to let it rest. But instead he got quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There was something I didn't tell you. Back in 2020, I got a letter. No return address. Just a small envelope, plain white. Inside was a Polaroid. Looked like it was taken with one of those old trail cams. It showed Daniel and Josh walking along a creek bed I didn't recognize. But what stuck with me, it was the date scribbled on the back. March 25th, 2019. I sat up straight. That's 5 days after Daniel's last journal entry. He said I thought it was fake, maybe a prank. I burned it. Didn't want to feed into the conspiracy stuff. My chest tightened, because either the photo was a mistake, mislabeled, forged, meaningless, or it was something worse. If Daniel had still been alive after the final entry, then what else was the journal hiding? The next morning, I pulled out the copy of the journal I'd been given by the station. I scanned the last few pages again. The tone did shift grief, hopelessness, but it was still composed, still legible. I started noticing how neat the lines were, even the supposed final entry. No tremor in the writing, no weather damage. And one part I'd always skimmed. I buried him where he could see the mountains suddenly felt too polished, like something meant for someone to find. I brought these thoughts to Santos. She listened without interrupting, just jotting notes like she always did. When I told her about Miguel's Polaroid, she asked why he hadn't come forward sooner. I said he was trying to protect me. She nodded once, then leaned back and looked at me carefully. "There's a difference between truth and closure," she said. "And sometimes the story we're given is only the version someone once remembered." That sat with me. I started requesting access to older field logs, search routes, drone coverage, anything from 2018 through 2020. I cross-referenced them with weather data, trailhead cameras, even the insurance investigation records. Most of it matched up. But then I found a footnote buried in an environmental survey from 2019. It was a ranger report noting signs of human activity in a restricted area, rough shelter, small fire ring, discarded food packaging. The area was flagged as a possible squatter site, but never followed up. The location less than half a mile from where Josh's body was found. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept circling back to the idea that maybe Daniel hadn't planned a joint disappearance, at least not originally. Maybe Josh was never supposed to stay. Maybe something changed. Or someone came across them out there, someone Daniel hadn't counted on. And then there was the question no one wanted to ask if Daniel lied in that journal even about one thing. What else was untrue? The next part of this story isn't something I like to revisit. But it started with a napkin. Torn, water-stained, barely readable, slipped into an anonymous envelope, no return address. It showed up in my mailbox the following Thursday. No note, no explanation. Just 5 words written in shaky pen. "You were almost out west." I turned it over. On the back, a faint charcoal rubbing of something round. I didn't recognize it at first, but then I remembered Daniel used to mark his trail maps with old silver dollars. Said they were the perfect size to circle a search radius. Only this one wasn't a coin. It was a symbol. Something I'd never seen before. And that was the moment I stopped believing the story ended with the journal. I kept that napkin sealed in a sandwich bag on my nightstand for 3 days before I showed it to anyone. Every time I looked at it, I found myself drawn back to the handwriting, shaky, uneven, like whoever wrote it had been cold or scared or both. The message wasn't long, but it didn't feel random. You were almost out west. 5 words. 5 words that didn't match anything from the journal or the search reports or Daniel's past emails. On the back, that charcoal rubbing. It bothered me more than the writing. The symbol was circular, uneven at the edges, with 3 small breaks near the top, almost like a wheel missing a few spokes. I ran it against trail logos, conservation patches, even hiker subgroups. Nothing matched. Eventually, I brought it to Santos. We met in her office, and I placed the napkin down without saying a word. She studied it for a long time, then sat back in her chair and asked, "Have you shown this to anyone else?" I shook my head. She nodded slowly. "It doesn't ring a bell, but I'll pass it through evidence. See if it connects to anything in the system." Then she asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Have you heard of a place called Firewatch Station 9? I said no. She told me it had been decommissioned in the late 90s, an old observation post in the northern range of the park near a boundary that wasn't even listed on public maps anymore. The land around it had suffered erosion, a few old rock slides, and they'd pulled it from trail access for safety. But some people still hike out there, she said. Off-grid types. Squatters sometimes. That night I pulled up every backcountry map I could get my hands on. I traced the location of the station, then overlaid it with the drone's flight path, the one that had led them to Daniel and Josh's shelter. The 2 sites weren't far apart. Maybe 6 miles as the crow flies. Not an easy distance in those mountains, but not impossible either, especially if someone knew the land. A few days later, I got a call from Miguel. He asked if I could come over. When I got there, he was in the garage flipping through a storage tub of old scout gear. He said he'd found something I might want to see. At the bottom of the bin, wrapped in an old fleece blanket, was one of Daniel's field journals, not the one recovered with his body, but older, from 2016, based on the entries. Miguel hadn't looked through it since the disappearance. We opened it together on the workbench. It wasn't a survival log, not exactly. More of a field notebook. Notes about trail conditions, gear repairs, supply calculations. But scattered between those pages were things that didn't belong. References to campsites that didn't exist on the map. Sketches of rock formations marked with symbols. And on one page, torn and half faded, was the same circle that appeared on the napkin. It wasn't labeled, but beneath it, Daniel had written something in tiny print. One path out. West Rim. I sat with that sentence for a long time. You were almost out west. If Daniel had left a clue buried somewhere in his notes, or worse, intentionally held back from the journal, then maybe someone else had known about it too. I called Santos again, asked if she'd heard back about the napkin. She said it hadn't matched anything in the local database, but she'd sent the image to a contact at a neighboring jurisdiction, someone who'd worked fringe activity cases near the state line. A week passed, then another. Nothing. I went back to my routine as best I could. Worked my shifts at the hospital, visited Josh's gravesite when I could stomach it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was circling something important. Then, one morning I came home to find an envelope taped to my back door. Plain white. No stamp, no address. Inside was a single photograph. Grainy, black and white. Looked like it had been taken from a great distance or through poor optics. It showed two figures, male, probably adult, standing near what looked like a fire ring. No date, no caption. But on the back, scribbled in the same uneven handwriting as the napkin, were two words, "Still watching." I took it straight to Santos. She examined it under a lamp, then held it up to the window light. "Where'd this come from?" I told her. She didn't say much after that, just folded it back into the envelope and said, "We may need to revisit the search boundary." Later that afternoon, she called in a favor with a small team of rangers familiar with the backcountry no-access zones. They agreed to do a sweep, nothing formal, nothing on the books. Just a quiet recon of the area near Station 9. 3 days into the sweep, I got a message. The team had found something. An old trail marker, hand-carved, nailed into a tree trunk so weathered it had nearly blended into the bark. Below it, a worn boot track, too degraded for prints, but fresh enough that someone had stepped there after the last snowfall. They followed the path for half a mile before it vanished into a ravine. No sign of a structure, no people, just a ring of stones still faintly warm from fire. One of the rangers snapped a photo. When they sent it to me, I stared at the formation of the rocks and something clicked. It wasn't random. It was the same pattern Daniel used in the fire pit from the survival site, the same layout shown in the drone images. Whoever had been there knew that, either because they'd learned from him, or because they'd been with him. The next day, Santos pulled me aside before I left the station. She said something quiet, careful. "Sarah, this isn't about closure anymore. This is about understanding what really happened out there. And I think you've been closer to the truth than any of us were willing to admit." I asked her if she thought Daniel had ever planned to come back. She paused for a long time, then said, "I think he wasn't the only one writing the ending." That night I pulled the napkin out of its plastic sleeve again. For the first time I looked closer at the faded edges, not the symbol, but the paper itself. In the right corner, barely visible in the light, was something I'd never noticed before. A stamped letter, worn down, but still readable. G. Holloway Intake Services. I didn't know what that meant. But it wasn't park-related. It wasn't from the mountains. It was a name. A service. Something tied to a system. And whatever it was, it didn't belong in Daniel's world. That was the first time I wondered if the plan had never been Daniel's to begin with. I'd never heard of G. Holloway Intake Services before that day. The name didn't match any clinic or agency in Knox County, and it wasn't tied to anything in Daniel's past. No billing records, no listed appointments, not even a post office box. But it felt deliberate, the way it was half-stamped on the edge of that napkin like someone had folded it quickly and tucked it into a coat pocket. I brought the name to Santos. She did her usual quiet scan through state databases, then checked with regional mental health boards, parole offices, transitional housing programs. Nothing. Not even a ghost entry. But when she ran the stamp wording through a nationwide intake registry, one partial hit came back. It wasn't local. It wasn't even Tennessee. It was in central Idaho. There was a facility listed there, long defunct, once registered under a parent nonprofit called the Harrow Group. The intake services were supposedly designed for people leaving incarceration or long-term psychiatric care. Off-grid support for moral redirection, whatever that meant. The records were scrubbed, barely a paper trail left. But the contact associated with that intake office was listed as a Karen Holloway. I remember just sitting there staring at the screen while Santos printed it out. Something about the combination of names Holloway-Harrow Group felt off. Manufactured. I asked if there was a way to reach anyone from the original operation. Santos said the registry contact was listed as inactive since 2017. No phone, no site. But she'd dig deeper. In the meantime, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I pulled out Daniel's digital files, his old external drive that I'd kept boxed up in the hall closet after everything happened. I wasn't even sure it would boot, but when it did, I started combing through folder after folder. Tax returns, hiking route logs, scanned gear receipts. But buried deep in a folder labeled simply Prep was a spreadsheet. Password protected. I guessed 3 combinations and got it on the 4th Josh's birth date and initials. Inside were inventory lists, caches, 3 separate drop points each marked with grid coordinates and supply notes. And next to one entry, a red-marked line from early September 2018 were 2 initials I'd never seen him use before, GH. I checked the grid reference. It was located about 5 miles southeast of Firewatch Station 9, just over the state border. Out of ranger jurisdiction. I brought the file to Santos. She reviewed it in silence, then asked if I could get away from work for a couple of days. I didn't have to think about it. That next morning, I met her and a search tech named Nolan outside a locked service gate about an hour north of the last trailhead. The road had long since crumbled, washed out in sections overgrown in others. We hiked in with minimal gear. Quiet steps, no unnecessary chatter. The farther we went, the more it felt like the air changed, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. It was late afternoon when we found it. The coordinates took us into a shallow gully overgrown but walkable, where the slope curled into a sunken ridge. At first we thought it was just old debris, a collapsed lean-to maybe, or fallen limbs. But underneath the brush there was a tarp, a weathered military-grade kind, tucked carefully between stones. When Nolan peeled it back, we found plastic storage bins. 2 were still sealed. One had burst from exposure. Inside were ration packs, flashlights, a folded rain poncho, a field stove. One tin had a waterproof envelope sealed with wax. Santos opened it with a penknife. Inside were 2 things. A printed intake form with Daniel's name typed in the applicant field and a small black and white photo of Josh. Not from the trip, from much earlier. School picture, maybe 7th grade. On the back, written in pen, were 3 words, Sustainable Unit, 28. Santos said nothing for a long time. Then she turned the form over and pointed to a signature line. It had been signed, but not by Daniel. The name read M. Harrow. We hiked out without speaking much. Back at the station, she pulled up archived nonprofit records and eventually found it. Margaret Harrow, listed as executive director of the Harrow Group from 2009 through 2016. After that, her trace went cold. The group dissolved assets redirected to shell organizations. but one address was still tied to her name, a mailing drop outside Bend, Oregon. I wasn't sure what to do with any of it. That was farther than Daniel had ever traveled, but the phrase stuck with me, sustainable unit. A few days later, Emma called. She said something had been bothering her, something she hadn't mentioned before. The last night she'd seen Josh before the trip, he'd shown her a small bracelet. Leather cord, cheap-looking, with a wooden disc tied in the center. It had 3 small circles carved into it. He'd said his dad gave it to him for the next chapter. She hadn't thought much of it then, but hearing about the photograph, about the number 28, she remembered something else. He said, 28's my lucky number now. I asked if she remembered what he meant. She said no, but the way he'd said it didn't sound like luck. It sounded like assignment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself searching keywords I never imagined typing: off-grid child programs, alternative discipline models, wilderness reform. The deeper I went, the more I found forums talking about these private operations, many of them unregulated. Facilities using behavioral restoration as a cover for something closer to disappearance. One post, anonymous archived, mentioned a retreat in Idaho that moved its base every few years. Clients never saw the full staff. Minors were brought in via referral, and parents were told not to make contact for 6 months minimum. Another user posted a warning: they use numbers, not names. I was 17. I was Unit 28. I stared at that for a long time. Then I looked back at the intake form. Daniel's name had been typed as applicant guardian, not patient, not client. He hadn't run to escape. He'd been enrolled, or recruited, or pulled, and somehow he brought Josh with him. The problem was, Unit 28 had a location, a purpose, a structure, and whatever had been planned, it didn't match what we found in that valley. That lean-to, those 5 months of survival. They weren't part of a system. They were a collapse. And if someone had been watching, if that photo, that napkin, that fire ring meant what I thought it did, then maybe the reason everything fell apart wasn't just Daniel's fear or desperation. Maybe someone changed the plan. And maybe they were still out there. When I finally agreed to meet with the woman from Bend, I didn't expect it to feel so ordinary. She introduced herself as a volunteer researcher with a missing persons coalition, said she was doing archival work on shuttered rehabilitation centers in the Northwest. Her name was Carla Monroe. Soft-spoken, older than me, mid-50s maybe, wore her hair back in a gray braid, and carried everything in one of those canvas totes people bring to farmers' markets. I met her at a diner outside Boise, halfway between her apartment and the storage unit where she'd kept her files. We made small talk over coffee, but I could tell she already knew who I was. She didn't push it. Just reached into her bag and slid over a manila folder, said, "I think this belongs closer to your end of the country than mine." Inside were photocopied intake logs from a facility called House of Grace, Idaho State, certified from 2011 to 2016. Owned and operated by Margaret Harrow under a religious 501c3. The paperwork was clean in the legal sense. Operated as a restorative shelter for women and youth funded through donations and a patchwork of private partners. No federal grants, no oversight. The logs were thin, barely legible in some spots, but the names were what stopped me. Most were first names only, sometimes initials, occasionally just numbers. But 2 lines jumped out. One read Daniel W., temporary, intake via Holloway. The other, several pages later, simply said J. Whitaker, 28, deferred placement. I asked Carla how she'd gotten hold of them. She said she'd recovered them from an abandoned filing cabinet during a volunteer cleanout near Cascade, back when the last known building associated with the Harrow Group was condemned. The rest of the documents had been shredded. These had been misfiled under tax forms. She leaned forward, then her voice low. "I don't think your husband was trying to vanish on his own. I think he was moved." I asked by who. She said we don't know yet, but it was organized, coordinated. And this isn't the first time someone from one of those rosters showed up dead. The phrase made me nauseous. She showed me another record-coded correspondence from something labeled Intake West, GH. The handwriting was sharp angular. It referenced a transition schedule, a transportation fee, and a phrase I'd already seen once before: Sustainable Unit 28. That night back in the motel, I laid everything out on the bed, every page, every copy. I kept returning to the phrase deferred placement. It wasn't just Josh's number. It was his label, his role in whatever plan Daniel had been pulled into. I didn't sleep, just kept rereading the same 3 lines until they lost meaning. The next morning, Carla took me out to the place where House of Grace had once stood. It was just a slab now, foundation, some twisted piping trees pushing through the old support posts. But what struck me was how isolated it was. Not off a road, not near a town, just tucked behind a faded cattle gate 4 miles off a highway no one used anymore. She said the building had been used long before Harrow bought it, first as a religious retreat, later as an alcohol recovery lodge. But by the time Harrow registered it, the paperwork had gone quiet. Private donations, no accreditation, no inspections. She showed me a tree near the edge of the lot where someone had carved a faint symbol, circular, split near the top. It matched the one from the napkin. I ran my fingers over the bark. Carla said, some survivors called it the burn mark, said it meant you weren't going back. On the flight home, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph in the supply tin. Josh, 7th grade. If the Harrow group had that image, they'd been watching long before Daniel ever disappeared. Possibly even before the debt got bad. Santos picked me up from the airport. She didn't say much until we were halfway back to Knoxville. Then she said a box had arrived while I was gone. No return address, but the postmark was from Montana. It was addressed to me, handwritten in all caps. Inside was a cassette tape. No case, just a single line written in pen on the label 1:12 a.m. There was no note, no explanation. We had to borrow a tape player from the records room. When Santos hit play, there was nothing at first but ambient static. Then the faint sound of wind, maybe trees. And then a voice. Male, uncertain, whispering. "My name is Lily Saunders," the voice said. "This is the 3rd tape. If you're hearing this, I hope you got out." I didn't. The tape cut out. Santos rewound it 3 times to make sure we heard it right. We did. I asked if she recognized the name. She said she didn't. Neither did I. We logged the evidence and filed the audio with a transcript. But the time written on the tape, 1:12 a.m., stuck with me. It wasn't random. I checked Daniel's journal again that night. On the page dated March 15th, the night Josh fell, he wrote that Josh lost consciousness sometime before sunrise. Around 1. He never gave the exact time. But 1:12 a.m. would have been about when Daniel realized there was no way out. Whoever sent that tape knew that detail. And whoever Lily Saunders was, she was still alive when Daniel and Josh weren't. That changed everything. The name Lily Saunders didn't show up in any of our files. No local cases, no missing persons. Not in Tennessee, not in Idaho, not even across the National Registry Santos pulled. But something about that tape, just the sound of her voice, made it clear she wasn't a hoax. Whoever she was, she'd been part of the same system Daniel had brushed up against, and she'd survived long enough to leave behind a warning. The problem was there was no context, no return address. Just the whisper of wind, a time code, and her name. Santos decided to send the audio to a specialist, a retired analyst from the Bureau who occasionally helped with backlogged cases. He ran a sound profile and isolated the background frequencies. It took him 2 weeks, but what came back was definitive. The ambient noise wasn't wind through trees, it was mechanical, like air moving through ductwork or an industrial vent. You could even hear a faint rhythmic creaking every few seconds, like metal settling under weight. He said it sounded like the inside of a basement or a sub-level shelter with forced ventilation. Nothing about it was natural. That narrowed things. The House of Grace property, according to Carla Monroe, had no basement. But another former Harrow facility did. An old orchard retreat 20 miles outside Missoula, Montana, previously listed as a summer rehab program. When Santos pulled the demolition report, it confirmed the main building had a lower-level cinder block walls, reinforced doors, no windows. It had been torn down in 2019, but not before a federal inspection had flagged inhumane conditions and evidence of restricted confinement. The final line of the report stated that the building had been evacuated before follow-up interviews could be conducted. No staff were available. The names of the residents were never confirmed. I stared at that sentence for a long time. We didn't know if Lily Saunders had ever been placed there, but the timeline fit. If Daniel and Josh had been funneled toward a program with rotating facilities, some fixed, some mobile, it would explain the strange location codes in the intake paperwork. It would also explain how someone like Lily could vanish without a trace and resurface years later with just a tape and a name. It wasn't enough to charge anyone. Not yet. But Santos pushed for a wider net. She got approval to contact agents who'd investigated fraudulent wilderness therapy programs back in the early 2010s. Most of them had been reassigned or retired, but one remembered the Harrow Group. He said the organization had a tendency to move just before inspections. Said their intake partners were never held legally responsible because they always framed participation as voluntary. It started to make sense why Daniel's application listed him as guardian applicant. He wasn't being committed. He was being recruited. I asked Santos what that meant for Josh. She didn't answer for a long time, then finally said, if Daniel believed he was entering a system that would take care of both of them, it's possible he thought this was protection. Protection. I went home and dug out the last of Daniel's old notebooks. Not the prep spreadsheets, not the survival logs, just the ones he used to keep by his bedside. He used to scribble ideas in them, project estimates, tool orders, gear, upgrades. But in one of the later pages, buried between a drawing of a pulley system and a packing checklist, he'd written a single phrase over and over again. 28 is safe. 28 is safe. 28 is safe. I took it to Miguel. He held the notebook for a long time before finally saying he didn't write that for himself. He was trying to believe it. That same week, a contact from the Montana Property Records Office emailed Santos a lead. A maintenance contractor had submitted a repair invoice in 2015 for a location tied to the Harrow Network electrical upgrade soundproofing and airflow ducting. Attached to the invoice was a signed name. Karen Holloway, the same name from the napkin stamp. She'd never been listed publicly in any Harrow documents. Never filed as staff. But there it was in plain black ink confirming she'd been involved behind the scenes. We tried to track her. Her name was too common, too scattered. But the handwriting matched one other item, the envelope that had delivered the tape. Santos forwarded the findings to federal contacts. They opened a quiet file. It wasn't a full investigation, but it was something. And then 2 weeks later, a second envelope arrived. This time addressed not to me, but to Carla Monroe. It had been left at her apartment door in Bend. Inside was a photograph. Not of Josh, not of Daniel. It showed a small basement room, cinder block walls, steel cot, dim light overhead. In the corner, barely visible, was a piece of red string tied around a vent grate. On the back of the photo were 5 words. Tell her Buddy is real. Carla called me that night, barely able to speak. She said when she was a girl, her family had a golden retriever named Buddy. He'd died when she was 8. It was something she'd only ever written about once, buried in a blog post she'd published under a pseudonym back in 2003. a post about being a survivor of forced intake at a behavioral camp she never named. Whoever sent that message knew. Santos reviewed the photo. She believed it had been taken recently. The timestamp metadata had been scrubbed, but the paper stock was modern, the ink still fresh. That meant Lily was still alive. Somewhere. And she wasn't the only one who remembered. The case files shifted. No longer just a disappearance. Not just a death in the mountains. This was systemic. Layered. And still active. Santos drafted a memo. Requested expansion of the search authority. Coordinated with interstate investigative coalitions. For the first time, someone higher up was paying attention. But none of it brought Josh back. None of it changed what Daniel had done. Still, something had shifted. Not closure, but direction. Because for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't staring backward. I was walking towards something. Josh and Daniel were buried together in the fall 5 years to the day after they vanished. The service was quiet. Just family, a few friends, some of Daniel's old hiking crew, and a few people from the search teams who never stopped checking back in. We chose Highland Memorial in Knoxville, where Josh used to leave flowers at his grandfather's grave. I stood there with Miguel, Emma, and Santos. The leaves were starting to change. That particular silence you only get at the start of October, it settled over all of us. I didn't speak at the funeral. I didn't feel the need to. What needed to be said had already been lived. But afterward I stayed behind, just long enough to press my hand against the stone marker. It read Joshua Whitaker 2002-2019, loved beyond words. Daniel's name was etched just below his. No title, no quote. Just the dates. I still don't have a neat answer for what happened out there. The journal Daniel left behind was real. His handwriting. His thoughts. But I know now it wasn't the full story. It was a version of it. One where guilt could be explained in clean lines and grief could be buried with the body. But truth isn't neat. It frays around the edges. Karen Holloway was never found. Neither was Margaret Harrow. The House of Grace records disappeared again after Carla's files were leaked to a watchdog site, and the nonprofit connections we uncovered dissolved just as quickly. We don't know who sent the tape, or the photo, or what happened to Lily Saunders after that final whisper. But we do know this: the Harrow network operated in plain sight for years. It dressed itself in moral language in scripture and self-reliance. But underneath it, it preyed on people like Daniel, scared, isolated, under pressure, and called it salvation. In the months that followed the investigation, I spent a lot of time thinking about what justice looks like when there's no courtroom, no trial, no arrest, just unanswered questions and the long work of remembering. I used what remained of the insurance money to establish a fund in Josh's name, not for scholarships, for intervention, for single parents under pressure, people on the verge of losing their homes or facing custody hearings or drowning in debt with no one to call. We keep it small, quiet. We don't require much paperwork, just a conversation. Miguel visits the house more now. He still hikes on the weekends. He says he feels Daniel out there sometimes not as a ghost, but as a man who made the worst mistake of his life and didn't know how to stop it. I believe that, and I forgive it. Emma graduated last spring. She left a folded drawing at the grave that day. A pine tree sketched in pencil and one line in Josh's handwriting from an old note she'd kept. I want to live where things are quiet and real. I still hear his voice in my head sometimes. Not the last night, not the panic, just the way he used to narrate the trails when we'd hike together. Naming every tree, every sound, like he was teaching the woods how to be themselves. The truth is, we don't always get the justice we want, but we can make sure the silence doesn't win. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name, no voice, and no truth gets buried again.